They came with flags and crosses, with textbooks and guns. They said they were bringing light to darkness, that they were on a mission to civilize the savage. But what followed was not education, it was erasure. Not progress, but plunder. Not peace, but pain. They called it a civilizing mission. But what kind of civilization enslaves millions? What kind of progress wipes out entire cultures? They massacred, looted, tortured, and ruled through fear, then wrote the history books calling themselves saviors. Today, we are told to remember colonizers as visionaries, builders of nations, even heroes. But let us ask a simple question. Can you civilize a nation by destroying its civilization? The myth of civilization, what the colonizers claimed. From the 17th century through the 20th, European empires spread across the world. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, and later Germany and Belgium. Their justification was consistent across continents. They claimed they were not invading, but uplifting. They were not robbing, but reforming. They were not killing, but saving souls. This was the doctrine of the white man's burden, popularized by Rudyard Kipling. The idea that it was the duty of white Europeans to rule over non-white peoples because they were lesser, uncivilized, and needed guidance. The British in India said they were bringing law and order. The French in West Africa claimed they were bringing culture. The Spanish in the Americas claimed to bring Christianity and peace. The Belgians in Congo said they were promoting trade and development. This grand illusion became the civilizing mission, a lie so powerful that it rewrote world history. But here's the truth. These were not missions of civilization. They were missions of control, of extraction, of domination, of cultural genocide. Even while preaching modernity, the colonizers burned libraries, erased languages, outlawed native traditions, imposed alien laws, and executed anyone who resisted. Civilization was not something they brought. It was something they destroyed. What real civilization looked like before colonization. To understand the true horror of colonization, we must first understand what existed before the colonizers arrived, because only then can we see the scale of what was lost and the depth of the lie that colonizers brought civilization to the world. India, a civilization of knowledge, trade, and harmony. Long before the British set foot on Indian soil, the subcontinent was home to one of the oldest and richest civilizations on Earth. India accounted for over 27% of global GDP in the early 18th century. It had thriving industries, textiles, steel, shipbuilding, agriculture, and trade. Urban planning, irrigation, and sanitation systems existed in ancient cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa 5,000 years ago. But India's strength wasn't just economic. It had advanced education systems. Institutions like Nalanda University, Est 500 CE, attracted students from China, Korea, and Central Asia. The Gurukul system emphasized holistic learning, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and ethics. Indians used the concept of zero, calculated pi, practiced complex surgeries, and developed sophisticated legal systems. Religions coexisted. Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and later Muslims shared cultural spaces and contributed to knowledge and arts. India was not a land of chaos. It was a land of order and diversity, rooted in its own evolving system of civilization. India's civilization wasn't just old, it was interconnected, artistic, and inclusive. Among the oldest was the Tamil civilization, which dates back well beyond 1,000 years in oral tradition and over 5,000 years in documented history. Tamil Sangam literature revealed organized societies, maritime trade, and assemblies. Chola and Pandya kings built vast temples, irrigation networks, and even maintained naval fleets that reached Southeast Asia. Temples like Brihadiswarar and Meenakshi still stand as testaments to architectural and spiritual excellence, some over 1,000 years old, built without colonial help. India was not a fragmented land of tribal skirmishes. It was home to thriving kingdoms, knowledge systems, and cultural depth. What the British brought was not civilization. It was economic collapse, famines, and forced erasure of identity. Came as traders for an organized and systematic looting. Africa was not a blank slate before colonization. It was home to rich empires, powerful kings, and centers of learning that rivaled anything in Europe. The Mali Empire, 13th–16th century, had massive cities like Timbuktu, with universities, libraries, and thousands of manuscripts. Mansa Musa, its ruler, is still considered the richest man in recorded history. The Kingdom of Congo had a structured bureaucracy, currency systems, and international diplomacy, even before Portuguese contact. In Ethiopia, Christianity existed since the 4th century, and its rock-cut churches of Lalibela remain architectural marvels. Africa had trading ports, legal systems, and mathematical and astronomical knowledge. It wasn't discovered by Europe, it was raided. Before the arrival of the Spanish, the Americas were home to millions of people and sophisticated societies. The Inca Empire had roads stretching over 40,000 kilometers, complex agriculture on mountain terraces, and a welfare system that fed the poor. The Maya were expert mathematicians and astronomers, tracking celestial movements, building pyramids, and recording history in glyphs. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Iroquois in North America, practiced representative democracy, which even influenced the U.S. Constitution. Native Americans lived in harmony with nature, practiced communal ownership, and had systems of law and spirituality deeply rooted in the land. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have a history going back over 60,000 years, the oldest continuous culture on Earth. They had complex kinship laws, oral histories, medicine, and land management practices like controlled burns. Their Dreamtime stories encoded knowledge about geography, seasons, and morality. The British called them primitive. But what is more civilized, living in balance with the earth or destroying it for profit? So who was truly civilized? Before colonization, these civilizations had knowledge systems, architecture, trade networks, spiritual and legal systems, art, literature, and diplomacy. And most importantly, they had it without genocide, global slavery, or mass theft. Yet when colonizers arrived, they burned the libraries, outlawed the languages, destroyed the economies, and then claimed they had brought progress. The truth is clear. You cannot bring civilization to a place that was already civilized. You can only destroy it and lie about it later. The colonizers claimed they came to teach the world law, order, and civilization. But what they really brought was massacres, slavery, torture, and genocide. They brought concentration camps, amputations, whips, and gallows. They came not as teachers, but as executioners. India, suppression through brutality. India's freedom movement was met with unimaginable violence. In 1919, British General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire on thousands of peaceful protesters at Jallianwala Bagh, killing over 1,000 men, women, and children in minutes. He was later honored in Britain. In 1943, as Bengal starved, Winston Churchill diverted food to British troops and said, "If food is so scarce, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" Over 3 million Indians died in a famine that was deliberately ignored. The infamous cellular jail, Kalapani, in the Andaman Islands was a torture center where Indian revolutionaries were whipped, force-fed during hunger strikes, kept in solitary confinement, and pushed into madness or death. This wasn't governance, it was terrorism under a flag. Africa, mass murder for resources. In the Congo, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed to bring Christianity and commerce. What he really brought was one of the most horrifying genocides in human history. Over 10 million Congolese were killed through forced labor, executions, mutilations, and starvation. Villagers had their hands chopped off if they failed rubber quotas. Children were burned alive, women were raped, and entire communities were destroyed for profit. In Namibia, German colonizers committed the Herero and Nama genocide between 1904 to 1908. 80% of the Herero people were killed through starvation, execution, and concentration camps. This became a blueprint for Nazi extermination tactics decades later. This was not a civilizing mission. It was industrialized slaughter. The Americas, erased by fire and disease. The Spanish and Portuguese wiped out entire civilizations under the banner of Christ and crown. The Aztecs, Incas, and Mayans were slaughtered, their cities burned, temples looted, and knowledge erased. Over 56 million indigenous Americans died through violence, slavery, and disease deliberately spread by settlers. Native children were forcibly taken, placed in residential schools, and stripped of language, names, and identity. In North America, the U.S. government conducted ethnic cleansing. The Trail of Tears forced 100,000 indigenous people off their land. Thousands died from exposure, starvation, and disease. The buffalo extermination was designed to destroy native food sources. These were crimes against humanity, not steps toward development. Australia, a silent genocide. The British colonization of Australia led to one of the least discussed genocides in history. Aboriginal people were declared fauna, not even counted as human beings under British law. Massacres wiped out entire clans. Children were taken away in the stolen generations, forcibly assimilated and abused. Some historians estimate the Aboriginal population declined by up to 90% after colonization. All of this was done while the British claimed they were civilizing the savages. Across continents, the same pattern, from India to Africa, the Americas to Australia, the pattern of colonialism was never civilization. It was systematic theft, violence, and control through fear. They burned down libraries and called us illiterate. They stole gold and diamonds and called us poor. They whipped children, raped women, and killed millions, then called us uncivilized. This is not civilization. This is barbarism, in uniform and in parliament. The civilizing lies, what they claimed versus what they did, for centuries, colonizers justified their brutality by saying they brought development to the colonies. They said they gave the people railways, education, law and order, religion and moral values. But let's break down these claims and see what they really meant. The railways, built to loot, not to connect. The British claim they built India's railways to modernize the country. In truth, the railways were designed to move resources, not people. The tracks connected mines, plantations, and ports to export raw materials to Britain. The goods moved efficiently, but Indian villages and towns remained isolated and ignored. Indians were banned from higher-class compartments, and third-class travel was often worse than cattle transport. Indians paid for the railways themselves through taxes and exploitative contracts that profited British companies. It wasn't infrastructure for India. It was a conveyor belt for systematic plunder. Before colonization, India and many parts of Africa had indigenous education systems. India's Gurukul system emphasized moral and practical learning. Nalanda and Takshashila universities drew scholars from across Asia. In Africa, oral tradition preserved history, law, medicine, and ethics. But colonizers dismantled these systems. Lord Macaulay, in his infamous 1835 speech, said the British must create a class of Indians who are Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. British schools taught Shakespeare, Christian theology, and colonial loyalty, but nothing of local history, heroes, or languages. The goal was not to educate, it was to condition, to create a class of obedient clerks and cultural traders. Education became a tool of mental colonization. The law meant to control, not protect. British colonizers claimed they introduced modern law and order. But the laws were not made for the people. They were made to control the people. Protesters were jailed without trial under acts like the Rowlatt Act in India. In Kenya and South Africa, colonial laws allowed land theft, racial segregation, and forced labor. Resistance leaders were imprisoned, hanged, or exiled for simply demanding dignity. The law protected colonial profits, not human rights. Religion, a tool for conversion, not compassion. Missionaries were often the first to arrive in colonized lands, not to heal, but to convert. In the Americas, native children were taken to residential schools, forbidden from speaking their languages, and forced to adopt Christianity. In India, incentivized conversions took place, with food, money, or access to education tied to religious change. In Africa, Christianity was weaponized to label native traditions as evil and to erase ancestral beliefs. This wasn't salvation. It was spiritual colonization, justified through heaven and hell. Colonizers mocked traditional attire, accents, diets, and customs. Languages were banned or suppressed, and European dress codes were enforced. Classical Indian music, African instruments, and Native American dance rituals were labeled barbaric. Libraries were burned, temples looted, and indigenous identity rewritten as inferior. They didn't just colonize land, they colonized the mind. So what did they really bring? They didn't bring progress, they brought profit. They didn't bring light, they extinguished it. They didn't build, they broke. Colonial development was never about improving lives. It was about making colonies profitable machines for empire, no matter how many lives were destroyed in the process. Voices of resistance, who called out the lie. While colonizers told the world they were building empires of progress, there were always voices of resistance. Thinkers, revolutionaries, and writers who saw through the illusion and exposed the ugly truth behind the so-called civilizing mission. These were the truth tellers, those who shattered the myth and called colonialism what it truly was, barbaric theft masked as virtue. Frantz Fanon, Colonialism as Psychological Violence. The Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist and revolutionary Frantz Fanon is one of the most powerful voices against colonization. In his works, Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth, he exposed how colonization was not just physical, but deeply psychological. Colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip. It turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts it, disfigures it, and destroys it. Fanon described how colonizers made the oppressed feel ashamed of their own identity, their language, skin, customs, and names, to keep them mentally enslaved even after physical chains were removed. Aimé Césaire, Colonialism as Brutality Dressed as Morality. Martinican poet and thinker Aimé Césaire, in his famous discourse on colonialism, wrote, "No one colonizes innocently. Colonization, thingification of the human being." He condemned how colonizers turned people into objects, tools of labor, numbers on a balance sheet. He said that Europe was only able to act civilized at home because it acted like a monster abroad. Césaire saw clearly that the so-called civilizing mission was just a cover for murder and greed. Mahatma Gandhi, Rejecting Western Civilization. While Gandhi is often remembered for nonviolence, he also directly challenged the idea that Britain had civilized India. In Hind Swaraj, 1909, he wrote, "Western civilization is such that one has only to be patient and it will self-destroy. It is based not on morality, but on materialism." He rejected the British claim that they brought law and education, arguing that India had its own systems long before the British and better ones. Gandhi emphasized that real civilization is about duty, community, self-control, and truth, not greed and conquest. Kenyan writer and scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o described how language was used as a weapon in colonization. In his book Decolonizing the Mind, he explained how African children were punished for speaking their native languages, even by African teachers who had internalized colonial values. The biggest weapon wielded by imperialism is the cultural bomb, to annihilate a people's belief in their names, their languages, their heritage, and ultimately in themselves. He urged Africans to return to their mother tongues, their stories, and their identities, and to resist the mental colonization that outlives the physical one. Edward Said, How the West Created a Fictional East Palestinian American Scholar. Edward Said revealed how Europe's entire image of the East was based on lies and fantasies. In his groundbreaking work Orientalism, Said exposed how Western scholars and media depicted Asians, Arabs, and Africans as exotic, backward, and irrational to justify domination. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. Said showed how colonialism didn't just steal land, it stole narrative power. It made sure the colonized could never speak for themselves. Shashi Tharoor, Calling Out Empire with Evidence. Indian politician and author Dr. Shashi Tharoor brought the discussion of colonialism into the modern mainstream. In his viral Oxford Union speech and book, Inglorious Empire, he argued that the British Empire was not a gift to India. It was a crime against humanity. India's share of the world economy went from 27% to 3% under British rule. There's nothing to be proud of in an empire that starved millions. Tharoor highlights that what Britain stole, destroyed, and suppressed cannot be whitewashed by stories of railways and English education. Their voices, our truth. These voices, from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and beyond, told the world, colonialism was not a civilizing mission. It was a campaign of brutality, theft, and erasure. And calling it anything else is not just a lie, it is a crime against memory. The legacy today, why the lie still matters. Some people say that's all in the past. Why dig up old wounds? Colonialism ended decades ago. But did it really end? Because the systems, inequality, and narratives created by colonialism are still alive today, in our economies, our education, our global politics, and even in our minds. The economic chains never broke. When colonizers left, they didn't return the stolen wealth. They left behind poverty, debt, and economic structures designed to benefit the West. India, once a global economic powerhouse, was left bankrupt and starving. Its economy collapsed from 27% of world GDP in 1700 to less than 4% in 1947. Africa, rich in natural resources, remains trapped in foreign debt, unfair trade deals, and resource extraction controlled by global corporations. Former colonies still export raw materials and import finished goods, continuing the colonial pattern of dependence. This is not post-colonial. It's neocolonialism in a suit and tie. Colonial borders still bleed. The artificial borders drawn by European powers in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East were made without consent and without knowledge of local realities. In Africa, tribes that had never lived together were forced into the same country, while others were split across borders. The result? Civil wars, ethnic conflict, and political instability that continue to this day. In South Asia, the partition of India and Pakistan led to the largest mass migration in history, over 1 million people dead, and tensions that still shape global politics. Colonialism didn't just conquer land, it deliberately divided people to ensure they never became powerful again. The education system still praises the colonizer. In many former colonies, children still grow up learning more about the Queen of England than their own ancestors. Textbooks still downplay colonial crimes or portray colonization as progress. Western figures are glorified, while indigenous heroes are reduced to footnotes. In Africa and South Asia, students still take pride in English fluency, while native languages and dialects disappear. This is not education, this is mental colonization. Western superiority still controls the narrative. Even today, the global North sees itself as the developed world, the rest as third world countries. Media coverage still treats Western lives as more valuable. Aid is portrayed as generosity, while the centuries of theft are rarely acknowledged. When people from former colonies demand reparations or recognition, they're told to move on. But how do you move on when your history has been erased, your wealth stolen, and your identity made into a stereotype? Cultural erasure still echoes colonialism tried to destroy culture, and in many places it succeeded. Indigenous people in the Americas, Australia, and Africa still fight for the right to speak their languages, perform their rituals, and wear their traditional dress. Museums in London, Paris, and Berlin are filled with looted artifacts, while the descendants of those cultures are told they can't be trusted with their own history. The Kohinoor diamond, the Benin bronzes, and thousands of other treasures remain in colonial hands, with no intention of returning them. This is not just about the past. This is about healing what is still broken. So why does it still matter? Because the colonizer's lie is still being told. Because the colonizer's systems still dominate. Because the colonizer's values are still considered superior. Until we confront the lie, we cannot write our truth. This is why remembering is revolutionary. A new narrative, reclaiming our history, reclaiming our power. For too long, the story of the world has been told by those who stole the pen. They wrote of conquest as discovery, of theft as civilization, of oppression as charity. But now we are writing it back, in our voices, through our truth. This is not just a history lesson, it's a call to reclaim what was taken, not just land and wealth, but dignity, identity, and legacy. Remembering is resistance. We were never uncivilized. We had mathematics before Europe knew numbers. We had trade routes while the West was still feudal. We had schools, scriptures, temples, drums, and poetry, long before colonizers sailed our way. To remember our history is not to dwell on pain. It is to refuse erasure. It is to say, we were always more than the chains they gave us. Celebrating our civilizations. The world must now know the greatness of the Tamil kingdoms, who ruled with compassion and built temples still standing after 1,000 years. The brilliance of Timbuktu, where African scholars studied astronomy while Europe burned witches. The strength of the Aztecs and Incas, who built floating cities and roads across mountains. The legacy of Aboriginal songlines, maps of the land passed through generations by memory and music. The wisdom of Indian gurukuls, where students learned philosophy, medicine, and spirituality, not to make money, but to serve truth. These are not forgotten lands, they are stolen narratives. Reclaiming our story means demanding accountability. It means returning the Kohinoor, the Benin bronzes, the sacred masks and ancestral bones sitting behind museum glass. It means reparations, not just as money, but in recognition, apology, and justice. It means rewriting textbooks, restoring languages, and honoring resistance fighters, not as rebels, but as freedom warriors. Decolonizing our minds. Colonialism didn't just take land, it colonized the way we think. It told us to be ashamed of our skin, our food, our gods, our voices. It taught us that to be educated was to be Western, that to be global was to be less local. Decolonization starts within. It starts when we stop apologizing for who we are. Building a future on truth, not lies. This isn't about revenge. This is about healing, about building a world that no longer hides behind empires and flags, where history is not whitewashed, where power is not built on lies, where every child knows their roots go deeper than colonial timelines. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our ancestors, we owe it to the next generation. Because we were never voiceless, we were silenced, we were never weak, we were wounded, we were never lost. Our stories were stolen, but now we speak, we rise, we remember, we reclaim. If this story moved you, if it made you feel, question, or even ache, don't let it end here. Share this video, talk about it, teach it, challenge what you've been told, because every time we speak the truth, we take back what was stolen. Subscribe to our channel to join this journey of truth-telling. Like this video if you believe history deserves honesty, and comment below with the stories you want the world to hear, because your voice matters. This isn't just a video series. This is a movement, and it starts with us.